Welcome to the Ayn Rand Fan Club. I'm Scott Schiff along with William Swig. William, how are you today?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm good. I am so happy to introduce our guest today. Jeffrey Tucker is the founder and president of the Brownstone Institute, author of thousands of articles, 10 books, most recently Liberty or Lockdowns. And, personally, he's just one of the bravest people and maybe one of the single best fighters all across the liberty movement. Jeffrey, thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, hey, thanks for having me in that very nice introduction.
To say I'm a fan is an understatement. I mean, honestly, it was your piece, Coronavirus as Ideology, that was my first kind of, even social media posting, kind of standing up to it. And it was great. And I wish more in the liberty movement had picked up your mantle.
Well, we can talk about that. I agree with you. I mean, I didn't like taking this on. Basically, what felt like alone for a very long time. I was writing about this January 2020, and people were saying to me at the time, why are you writing about this dumb virus in China? This is a waste of my time and yours. And what I had actually known is that for at least 15 years, the CDC guidelines and regulations on infectious disease had become weirdly draconian. I mean, like, you just can't believe it. You'd read through the plans that were in 2005, 2006, here you have, without any vote in Congress, without any legislation, without any debate, you've got this entire sort of administrative state apparatus with the approval of the then Bush administration, actually the urging of the Bush administration, to enact what really amounts to a big central plan in the event of a biological attack or the severe pathogenic outbreak or a pandemic. And the problem with all this stuff is that it was never that, I mean, there's a number of problems with it, but it was never clear exactly how you define these terms. The old regulations would say, oh, here's the level of severity of disease. It's either, and they had color coded, between, I don't know, green and red, or, with purple and yellow and all these other colors in between. Probably the last of the worst color is black. I don't really remember the way this worked, but the problem with that is that there's a presumption there that as the pathogen is discovered, you can also discover its severity and anticipate its consequences, which requires detailed information about the infection fatality rate, the case fatality rate, and all these other kind of things that you have to know. Well, it turns out you cannot know that until you actually experience the pathogen. In other words, there's no way to know what the case fatality rate is until there are fatalities that you can measure against case rates. So it's not like a pathogen arrives with a preset personality, a little tag on it, like, oh, here's SARS-CoV-2. It looks like it's going to be a 0.1 infection fatality. There's no way to know this. So what that does is it gives government a tremendous amount of discretion in calling anything that shows up whatever it wants to call it, and nobody's really in a position to disagree. And it's hardly surprising the government therefore has an incentive to exaggerate, everything, out of the precautionary principle in a philosophical sense, or just, out of power ambitions, that it just likes an excuse to get more power. So when I saw this pathogen coming out, I thought, well, seems unlikely, but they might deploy this apparatus. And if you look through the documents that were already extant at the time, dating back 15 years, the government presumed the right to close your business, to ban public events, to shut your houses of worship, to close down travel, to limit the number of people you have in your homes, to force you into a quarantine anytime, anywhere, for however long it wants, with or without being sick. So all those presumptions were already banked into the law. And I I had been writing about this for years. Like, do we really want to live with this sort of sword of Damocles hanging over ourselves all the time? So when this pathogen came out, and I saw there was, an election kind of brouhaha developing, and a great deal of public boredom, which is present in the world. I thought, this could be the one. I didn't quite believe it would happen, but I was trying to warn people that they could do this if they wanted to. So that was me in January 20. And of course, by March, it all got unleashed. Along with it, the disease panic, and then along with it, a kind of what I described as lockdown ideology.
You talked about them. You talked about them not knowing how the fatalities would stack up against cases. I remember in the beginning seeing a lot of footage from Wuhan where they're spraying the streets and all of that. And so do you think they got some data from China, and that's what they ostensibly based their future measures they'd take on?
The data from China that was coming out in January was really solid data, and it was showing a mild pathogen for the general population, a potentially severe pathogen for the elderly with and infirm. So the average age of death, we already knew, even going into the month of February, was 80, and that's been persistent throughout, which is, in the United States now, that's actually above the average age of death. So people die from coronavirus. The average person, the person who typically would die from the coronavirus, is older than the average age of death, and that's been true from the beginning. So this was we knew a lot about the virus even by late January. Now, that was from Chinese scientists, actually, because very scrupulous scientists looking at the outbreak there and looking at the doing good testing and everything else. But two things happened at the same time in February. One is that those scientists were shut down. They were not allowed to speak anymore. In fact, many of them were punished for cooperating with the West, and so their papers simply stopped coming out, and they were replaced by very ridiculous videos, where people are just dropping like flies all over the place. It was just like the movie Contagion. You're going along, suddenly foam's coming out of your mouth and you're dead. So those were all revealed to be fake in the meantime. But that, you're right, that's what terrified the politicians in particular were terrified. Now, the public health officials should not have been terrified. Why it is that some very powerful people in that realm decided nonetheless to push public panic and lockdowns still remains a very, very interesting question.
That's actually some good background about you, that you'd been studying it and seen it like a sort of Damocles. Because, I mean, once you get to March 2020, it's like, something really hit you. You can see it in that coronavirus's ideology. You're just like shocked by this young woman who'd been a hipster and now is telling you you're going to be killing people if you're out for no good reason.
Yeah. Well,
Go ahead.
Yeah, well, that's a very interesting philosophical question, because one thing I hadn't anticipated, because I think I was kind of hip to the fact that the state, as we know it, is always interested in finding a kind of good excuse for growing. Whatever the thing is. In the Middle Ages, it was to purify the soul, but in the 90s, it became, to protect us against, or in the early 2000s, protect us against terrorism, whatever the thing is. And so disease panic, disease is a good excuse as any. In fact, it's a particularly compelling one, because you're because you can't see the virus. It could be anywhere. And it speaks to issues of life and death in a very powerful way to people. So, but what struck me as very interesting is the kind of, I would say, like philosophical void in which this largely propagandistic campaign, or let's just say that the pathogen was just as bad as they were implying. In the early days, they were saying, throwing out numbers like 3 and 4%, but anyway, let's say it was that bad. So it entered into a kind of a philosophical void where you have a whole kind of generation, I would say like under 30s. There seemed to be a kind of a strange lack of purpose and meaning in many people's lives. I don't know why, bourgeois privilege, too much living off credit, not having to work too hard, just taking prosperity for granted, loss of, religions by now, just completely
lack of a higher purpose.
Lack of a higher purpose, or the lack of a mission, in life. And so suddenly you've got the government barking at everybody. Now we must come together to avoid this disease and crush the pathogen. And the way to do this is by sitting by yourself alone in a room, masked up and, wearing, sackcloth and ashes, and then the pathogen will go away. Okay, so a lot of young people, who paid no attention to cell biology in the 9th grade, believed all this stuff, especially among, sort of Zoom class, professional class. And it gave them a real mission. So yeah, immediately, almost immediately, actually, by late March, you had an entire sort of red guard, out there of citizen enforcers of mask mandates and stay-home orders, and demanding that everybody, kind of suffer and not have fun and give up their parties, and they're sending out drones into the sky to look for houses where there are too many cars parked in front of them, and they're turning them to the health department. All this stuff happened, and it became a real sort of, I would say, like pop philosophical commitment among a generation for whom nothing had ever happened and nothing really meant anything. It gave them a real sense of mission and purpose, which really does, I think, speak to a very big challenge for all of us to figure out, okay, if we really are living in a world with a complete philosophical void out there where people really cannot figure out how to find meaning in life except through some wild mass coercive crusade, that's a serious problem for the sustainability of freedom over the long term.
Do you think that part of the problem is government intrusion in people's lives? I think if government is intruding in all these areas of the economy, like education and medicine, and people start fearing for their general welfare, because they don't understand the government, or, they don't understand regulations. They're always anxious about being thrown in jail or fined for some arbitrary reason. Do you think that has something to do with this all pervasive fear?
Yeah, that's I think you're right about that. I do think that's only part of it. It's not just that you've got an overweening state out there with a gun to everybody's head, although that's a salient point. There's other strange things that have happened. I mean, one is the arrival of kind of and this has been going on for decades now. Well, of course, you have woke philosophy itself, which is just
right,
presents its own problems. But the safety culture itself, is a problem where people have never really faced danger or risk, and they don't know what that is, and they think that their rights are being violated if they're ever made to feel uncomfortable. And so much of our educational and economic lives are these days have been structured for decades around this idea of making everyone feel, constantly affirmed and valuable, and never taking risks, and never really facing danger, or even the competitive sports, for example, are not even practically for the bourgeoisie in this country practically abolished for all young people. I mean, you can't even go to birthday parties anymore for kids where they're playing pin the tail on the donkey because there's winners and losers, or musical chairs. Right? I mean, that's that we have a safety culture to the extreme now, and It's a little bit mysterious to me. Like even sometimes I look back at my own life and I'm just amazed. I remember it being in second grade and walking. It sounds like an old man talking here, but I would walk through, an urban streets in a big city for a mile and a half, at the age of what, 8, and my parents were good parents, but they never even occurred to them that this might be a problem. And these days, I don't believe that happens. I just can't even conceive of it, actually. Or that, between the time I got home from school and the time dinner began, I did whatever I wanted. I had a gang of friends. We'd go rummaging through the trash barrels behind the outlet malls and, ride our bikes and engage in, extremely dangerous activities like pulling a skateboard behind a bike and going over tall rock walls and getting all bloodied. I mean, that's just sort of what life is like.
Out of the 70s.
Yeah, right.
Oh, that was I was doing that stuff in the 80s and 90s. So
All right.
Yeah, I think something changed. Maybe it was after 9/11 or
I don't
maybe
know. Or maybe, yeah, I don't know, but there's been a big cultural change that we no longer want anybody to face risk or danger. So that's a strange thing, because it makes us vulnerable to being controlled by a state that is always out there saying, we're going to protect you, we're going to protect you, protect you. And then, so you're inclined to say, oh, please, please protect us,
Rand talked about how, values are that which you act to gain or keep. But I think there's a different mindset when you're in gain or growth mode versus keep mode, or just trying not to lose.
Yeah, that's a good point. And actually, let me add to that another slight complication here, and it has to do with something that's happened to us over, I would say, the last say gradually over the decades, which is we're experiencing far less class mobility than we used to. So we have really distinct classes. We have working classes, and we have professional classes. We have the upper level of the professional classes, and those are defined by access to educational institutions. And when I'm saying all this stuff, I'm not speaking as a leftist. I'm just saying that, in a capitalist social order, there should be a great deal of malleability. And yeah, I think that's the right word, malleability, and movement between these social classes, so that if you fall out of one, so you start a big business, it's small, it's medium, it's big, you take some risk you shouldn't have, you make an acquisition that doesn't pay off, the whole company goes bankrupt, suddenly you're starting over again. That is a kind of, but under those conditions, then what do? Well, you get financing, you tap your network and you build up again. And that sort of waves of success and failure would be typical in a free market, and you develop an ethos of trying and challenging, in those cases, taking risks for big rewards, and if it doesn't pan out, you'll have many other chances, right? But now with the regulatory state so intense, just getting into business alone is an immense challenge. The litigious culture where you can be bankrupted by any employee who wants to claim anything against you. You're facing, high tax regimes. What this has done is limited social mobility to the point that once people sort of bump into that professional realm in which you get 6 figures for pretending to work, they know they're living phony baloney lives. But they figure they only have one chance to do that. And if they ever fall out of that realm, they'll find themselves, working at the Chick-fil-A. And that's, the worst nightmare you can ever imagine. So people have become wildly grasping of their present social status. Just would you say Rand had this distinction between keeping and earning?
Gaining and keeping, yeah.
Yeah, gaining and keeping. So yeah, so you got a third of the American public now is just in this sort of keeping mode. That makes them quite vicious, you know.
Yeah.
Well,
Uh,
that comes from Rand's definition of life, right? Is that what you're referring to, Scott?
Well, values more specifically.
Oh, yeah. So a value is that which you seek to gain and or keep.
But I saw your interview with Thomas Massey discussing the CARES Act and how it kind of extended the wealth from small business to big business.
right.
I think some of that is happening. It's more as we're in a freer market. There's more opportunities to have that kind of class mobility to go up or down. And, you know, even in the days of the robber barons, you could become poor again. And in some ways, Nathaniel Branden did an essay years ago about big business against laissez-faire capitalism and how many big businesses find it easier to support regulation to thwart new competition than, you know, have to continue to innovate. And you know, I wonder if maybe you see some of that in COVID policies as well.
Oh, for sure. And this is actually one of the most devastating things for our country, but also for us intellectually. I mean, to discover that all the companies that we thought were going to be the great champions of capitalism, you know, with the great tech boom, the late 90s, and then after, we thought, oh, at least I did, but I'm an idiot. Thought that all these companies would shift the balance of ideological attachments from socialist style policies to capitalist ones, and that they would be the friends of the free market, because after all, they kind of, you know, crashed the market with all this new technology and relied fundamentally on consumer response and raised their own money through private financing, and then got viral and started beating the old analog companies, you know, all over the place. And I thought, wow, what a better demonstration of the free market than that. That will really drive home a deep conviction. That's so stupid now that I'm talking about like this, you know, and an attachment to freedom. What we saw during the COVID era was exactly the opposite, where big tech joined up, you know, very willingly. I mean, my friends on the left always tell me that no, this whole thing was big tech bought big government and then forced government to do what they wanted it to do. Okay, well, you know, that's really hard to say which way things go. I mean, but there's a hand and glove element here, which the hand, which the glove, we can debate. But there's no question that, you know, Facebook just, Mark Zuckerberg is immediately writing Fauci, going, "Let me know what I can do."
Mm-hmm.
The Washington Post, you know, I mean, like, I would forgive Jeff Bezos's Amazon for all of its gazillion billion dollars in profitability over the last 2 years, you know, and just say, well, hell, you know, the world is shut down. People needed groceries. It's good they ordered from Amazon. I'm glad Amazon was there. But Bezos owned the Washington Post. Washington Post was very consistently from the very beginning pro-lockdown. I mean, and censoring voices that warned against it, and in favor of closing schools, and in favor of everything. In the New York Times the same way. I mean, all the media outlets were working very tightly with big tech and the advertisers to push this lockdown agenda and censor and demonize those of us who are on the other side. So it was a shock to me. And, you know, I think the capitalists really need to think about what this implies for their affections for what we call capitalist institutions. It's not clear that they're actually for capital. And Milton Friedman used to say this too, you know. The big businesses are sometimes the biggest enemies of capitalism.
Well, and Rand wrote about Orrin Boyle and these government-inspired business bad guys as well.
What's that?
Rand in Atlas Shrugged, she wrote about these business people like Orrin Boyle that were in bed with the government, or even James Taggart that were like bad examples of cronyism.
Right. That, you know, that people misunderstand Atlas Shrugged all the time. This is not a paean to big business. In fact, most of her heroes were the doers, the workers, the producers, not the legacy businesses, you know. Right. So This is a very important thing to understand about, I said, about capitalist ideology in general. It is not a big business ideology. Now, if big businesses get that way through the free market and continue to defend the free market and face competitive pressure, then that would be good, you know. But that's not what we're seeing today. We're seeing something very different.
I think what we see is a lot of nominally private businesses. They're not really private. They're somehow mixed up with the government. And in thinking about how this happens, I'm thinking it starts with just letting the government regulate you and regulate your corporation. And the bigger your corporation gets, the more dependent you are on like government regulation or government contracts to keep you in business and to suppress your competitors and that sort of thing. There becomes this economic battle where the government gets involved and chooses a side. So I think that might relate to the philosophy underpinning this problem, is that how dependent are you on the government? And I think the bigger the corporation, the more dependent you are. And so I saw this COVID thing as maybe not primarily, but secondarily an attack on small businesses. They shut down a bunch of small businesses and then gave favors to the big corporations like the fast food industries or whatever. I was just wondering what you thought about that.
Oh, that's exactly what I saw going on too. It was really a shock, and you're right. These big businesses are always looking for ways to compete and crush the competition. This was the perfect opportunity for them, but it's not a fair way to go about things. And you mentioned dependency on large business on government. There's certainly that, but there's also an element of fear, which you brought up earlier. Once you get into business, you very quickly learn that you've got to partner with the administrative state or you're going to die. And it happens very quickly, with taxes and mandated benefits and unemployment insurance and registrations at the state level. And it's overwhelming, the compliance costs of just doing enterprise in America. And it's really intensified dramatically over the decades. And once you do this, I mean, you have to have every business has a huge HR department because compliance, forms going back and forth. So basically what's happened is that all business in America has been forced into a kind of partnership with the state. And if that's true, you're not going to be the first people out there to challenge government policies because you fear them, and that you can always be subject to some kind of retaliation. You're just interested in maintaining the peace.
The antitrust legislation is like the ultimate form of control, right? They threaten to break up your business if you don't comply.
That's exactly what happened with Facebook and Twitter and other big tech companies. They just say, look, we're looking at antitrust action, and plus you're allowing misinformation to get out there.
Right.
And it's like, what are we going to do about this misinformation? Well, and also, I mean, it's just amazing that that this happened. But you had, people like Fauci and Psaki and all the rest of them demanding that these big tech platforms censor people, and demanding that they shut down debate. You would think that this would be shot down by the courts immediately as a violation of the First Amendment. The First Amendment says, that government can't do this. But the several cases I know of that have been brought before the courts.
Speaking of what's acceptable, we did our last show on Rand's essay, The Establishing of an Establishment, where she talks about how favored government intellectuals are now starting to dictate what's acceptable to talk about. I mean, do you agree a recent example of that would be when Fauci and Collins wrote emails about how crucial it was for a devastating takedown of the Great Barrington Declaration?
Yeah, that's a clear violation of the First Amendment. And those emails got all unearthed through FOIA requests, and there's no question that that's what they wanted to shut it down. And ironically, they actually made the Great Barrington Declaration more famous than it otherwise would have been. I mean, I was there during the period in which that thing was being drafted, and we pushed it out very quickly. I mean, it was like within 24, 36 hours after its completion, the website was built, and we were suddenly, we were pushing it out there. But you never know about these things, and I've been in the digital realm for a very long time, and I never really know ahead of time if a campaign is going to just die or if it's going to go viral. I mean, or something in between. The digital world is very unpredictable in that sense. So
Right.
I had no sense of what was going to happen to this document. I think it would have been very likely it just come and gone, instead, of course, it went the other direction. But part of the reason it went the other direction was that, Collins and Fauci specifically assigned journalists to attack it. Well, that just brought attention to it.
I mean, I
think there was
remember it making huge waves when it first came out. Go ahead, William. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think that there was a lot of truth in the Great Barrington Project, and that's probably why these, so-called scientists in the government thought that they had to respond. But then initially they realized they were the wrong ones, and so then they went silent because they had no attack anymore, and they realized they needed to shut up to make your project go away.
I think probably, and it always mystifies me why it is that they got so angry about it. I think they had expected, well, I think there's how do I put this? So the censors, if they were convinced of the truth of what they were saying, and that truth is obvious, and they could convince people of it, there would be no reason to censor. You just let people say whatever they want. You can just kind of trust that the bad ideas die and the good ideas ascend to the top. But I think they knew that what they were doing was without precedent. That it was the unfolding of a kind of an implausible, very fragile kind of scheme. And so that's why they had to shut down any dissent. And there wasn't much. I mean, you think about it, lockdowns began in March. Apart from my writing and a handful of others, there was almost nothing out there all the way to July and August, and the mainstream media successfully demonized anybody who disagreed with lockdowns and masks and school closures and everything else. Even Trump participated in this. You remember by middle of April, Governor Kemp of Georgia said, "Look, this is dumb. This talking 2020. This is dumb. I'm going to open up this. I'm going to open up and get rid of all this corona restriction stuff because we're killing business out here." And Trump denounced him.
I do remember that, but I almost got the sense they had a personal thing going on too. But
well, I don't agree with Trump on that. I think that was a huge mistake on his part, and he should have fought against the lockdowns. I think
he eventually did.
Yeah, I think he eventually came around to the right side. But another point I had about this is that there's a certain amount of people who will understand a complex, sophisticated argument for something. You can teach the masses simple things, but not everyone's going to be educated enough to understand scientific theories and things about viruses. And so they will rely on experts. And when the government figured out that all they had to do was get a bunch of experts to promote these lockdowns, they realized they didn't have to go after the Great Barrington Declaration. They could just get a bunch of experts and pump out this propaganda in favor of lockdowns.
This went on and on and on for months and months and months. And it was really shocking to me that a lot of the people that were pushing out lockdown propaganda or staying silent, they knew better. But, there had become a real machinery had developed. I was talking about my writings 15 years ago about the topic, but over those 15 years, there was a lot of people that sort of bought into lockdown ideology by virtue of, Gates funding, combined with, the aspirations of the administrative state for more power. A lot of people in the epidemiological community had become intrigued by the idea of managing the social order like some sort of computer model. So a lot of people sort of bought into this, and they were anxious to try out their experiment, just like a lot of people wanted to try out communism in 1918 in Russia. It's really, people get bored with bourgeois life, and they're like, man, let's try something different. Let's blow up the world, start over again.
Well, how
So,
much do you think that's attributed to their ambition for trying, something new and succeeding in some new area versus their just lust for power and money? They know they need more money in this world to get what they want. And so they can't rock the boat. And so they go along to get along.
yeah, it's really that's for sure. That describes a lot of the academics within the epidemiological and medical community. They just went along because they are afraid of losing their status and position, and they just lack bravery, basically.
Yeah.
Um,
I was just going to say, you brought up that, the Ford Foundation or groups in Congress talking about, investigating the origins of the COVID lockdown policy, but then they decide, oh, they're not interested in the topic after all. I mean, someone like made them see that they didn't want to get the same treatment as, Dr. Bhattacharya or Koldorf. And that's how the establishment reinforces itself and makes people hesitant to stand up to them.
Sure, you just choose a few people and beat them brutally, and then let them serve as an example to other people. I mean, these days you've got a lot more people out there going, well, I never really believed in lockdowns. I think lockdowns are a really bad idea. And then you've got other people like Fauci saying, well, we never had a lockdown. I don't know what you're talking about. So, it's all, we're in this weird position where on one hand, you've got a tremendous amount of public anger that has arisen as people are looking at their businesses shattered and their kids all traumatized by being forced to wear masks for 2 years and so on. It's been just an amazing disaster. So you've got that on one hand. Then, on the other hand, you've got, the World Health Organization right now trying to codify lockdowns as a policy, put it into place, and make it official so that the rest of our lives we're going to have to live with this problem that at any moment when a new pathogen comes out, lockdowns could happen. And we're starting to see this with the monkey pox already. We're starting to see states already imposing mandatory quarantines for anybody who tests positive for monkeypox, which maybe that doesn't sound so bad, except that all right, well, what about those people who are exposed to the monkey virus? Well, what about the people who are, what if the monkeypox has a long latency period? Maybe you don't know you have it. Maybe you're not going to test fast. Maybe you're not even willing to test. Maybe you need to be forcibly tested. And so, one thing leads to another. Next thing you know, you've got lockdowns for the monkeypox or any other pathogen that happens to come along. And we've really got to have a completely different philosophy towards infectious disease if we're ever going to beat this.
Yeah. Now, there were early estimates of 0.6% fatality rate, making it 6 times deadlier than the flu. I mean, that rate didn't happen, but I mean, would 0.6 be enough to justify lockdowns? I mean, is there any death rate which would justify it? Or is it more just if it's really that deadly, no one needs to be told to stay home?
I would say the latter, but you have to connect to the. I mean, if lockdowns are ever going to be justified, you have to be able to demonstrate that there's some point to them. I mean, from a utilitarian point of view, do they work? Do they actually save lives on net? Is the benefits worth the costs? And that's what's never really been demonstrated. So I can't really imagine any conditions under which forcing lockdowns on like we've seen over the last 26 months or 28 months makes any sense under any conditions. And I'm on a lot of interviews where this question always comes up. Well, what are the conditions under which you would favor lockdowns? And the problem is that, and I said, well, you give me an example. And they said, well, let's just say there was a virus that's really, really prevalent, really, really severe, and just people are dropping like flies, like in the Black Death or something like that. So the problem with that hypothetical is it actually runs contrary to evolutionary biology, because we evolved with viruses, and in a way that has made it a sometimes dangerous dance, but that allows us to prevail over them. So viruses have sort of built in with them this own little machinery, in which for a virus to spread really quickly, it cannot kill its host. And if it is killing its host, like Ebola, then it's not going to spread quickly. So those things work as a real trade-off. That's why sometimes isolation and quarantines can work well for Ebola, and private companies in Africa have used these to great effect to limit the spread of Ebola, and that's good. But it lasts a couple of weeks, and that it's only for the sick. I mean, we've only quarantined for the sick ever in history, and most of those quarantines are, like I say, it's not as if quarantines are themselves a terrible idea. I mean, after all, when you go to the hospital, you've got a terrible pathogen. They keep you in the hospital until you're better. Partially to protect the community against whatever, if you've got an infectious disease that's genuinely deadly. But my point is that a mass pandemic is, let's just say, the logic of cell biology as we know it really precludes against anything remotely like that happening again. Not even 1918 can happen again, because most of those people who died in 1918 died of pneumonia, not H1N1. And now we have widespread use of antibiotics, which are just fantastic for killing off bacterial pathogens that have led to tremendous amounts of death in the past. And that's just, so it seems extremely unlikely we'll ever again have a virus that's 3 and 4% infection fatality rate. I mean, it just doesn't seem really possible, unless there's some sort of very, very long latency period, which is to say you're walking around with the virus, spreading it all over the place. It's super deadly, but you're not feeling these symptoms yet. And
that's kind of like wokeism. It came around in the 90s, and now we're feeling the real impact.
Yeah, that's right. There's a long latency for woke ideology. That's right. So the latency period is the condition here, which is why like I don't know if you've ever seen the movie Contagion, but in order to make that virus in that movie plausible, they had to build in a long latency period. So you'd have it for a month and not know it, that kind of thing.
There isn't. I'm thinking of the not smallpox, but chicken pox, and then they say the chicken pox virus turns into shingles when you're older. Is that like a latency period?
No, that's just a mutation, and the idea is that somehow catching chickenpox when you're young and getting over it doesn't provide broad enough immunity to cover you against catching shingles when you're in middle age or late middle age, something like that. That's the claim anyway. And so the virus was supposed, or the vaccine for chickenpox was supposed to be a vaccine for both shingles and chickenpox. The problem with that, I would think, and I'm not a specialist on this, is that I don't know how you test for that. If the distance, if the intertemporal distance between chickenpox and shingles is 50 years, I don't know how you exactly suss out the effectiveness of that kind of vaccine. And I never got the chickenpox vaccine. That's fine, but my big worry about, and by the way, the chickenpox was the last, I would say, sort of common skin virus that people structured life around deliberately catching in order to gain immunities. So, and you would do it as young as possible. So it would scar you as little as possible, and then you'd have lifelong. And so ever since World War II, people have deliberately exposed their children to chickenpox as a way of gained immunities. And you could say, oh, the vaccine was great because you didn't have to do that. On the other hand, well, we have a lot of generations now that don't understand the relationship between exposure, recovery, and immunity. They think that all health comes through shots, and
Yeah.
that's a real problem.
And the scientific establishment wasn't doing much to help clear that up in their zeal for trying to get everyone vaxxed.
Well, they denied natural immunity for the better part of 2 years. I mean, it's actually
Right.
one of the many scandals of public health and there's so many over the last 2 years, is that that they've. I mean, Fauci was asked about natural immunity one time in an interview. He said, "Well, I don't really know. I'll get you back to you on that." Well, he knew. I mean, he's not an idiot. So why they were so why they lied to so many people for so long is these are the kinds of questions that I have, and I'm putting together an informal beginnings of a commission through an informal meeting starting this weekend of some many top scientists that are looking into this, just to lay out the questions, not provide the answers, but just to lay out the most important questions we have.
Sure.
I have this idea about, well, it goes like this. The efficacy attributed to the COVID vaccines, much of that should be attributed to natural immunity. And I think there was some sort of cover up of natural immunity and trying to say, no, it's due to the vaccines. And so to make the vaccines look more effective. Do you have any evidence for that? Or do you agree with that?
We know that seroprevalence studies are showing 75% seroprevalence among children, kids under 18, and in a population-wide seroprevalence in the United States in general at about 58%. Seroprevalence studies does not measure vaccine induced or vaccine imposed immunity. It only looks at resistance to disease as built up by exposure. So, I mean, and by the way, this data comes straight out of a report released by the MMWR by the CDC itself, and that was about 6 weeks ago. And I found it to be utterly amazing because what it shows is that the vaccines have not made the contribution to the achievement of herd immunity that they were supposed to make. In that sense, they've completely failed. So, the hope is that, okay, the vaccines failed to stop infection, failed to stop transmission. Eventually, everybody gained immunity through exposure. But maybe the vaccines prevented death, or at least postponed death in the age cohort that was most vulnerable to it. But and that's great if that's true. But the data definitely are mixed there. There seems to be, in the mortality data itself, no demonstrable relationship between that sort of late age mortality and vaccine status. So I think we're still waiting for that, but there are other studies that show some effect, and others that are actually even more gradated. They show some effect from traditional viruses like J&J and AstraZeneca, but not from the mRNA vaccine. So, but it's just interesting because the vaccines are wildly oversold from the very beginning, and deliberately, accidentally, I don't know, but everybody was told when the vaccines were rolled out, if you get the vaccine, you're not going to get sick. That's what everybody was told. We heard this message 1,000 times. It was broadcast on college campuses all over the country at CDC expense and so on. So it was really something. just the
Well,
amount of propaganda. And it's really dangerous for vaccines in general. And you've noticed this, I have too. I'd never even heard of anybody in my life who was against vaccines until recently. And
and see,
I
yeah,
didn't
they
even,
did more for the anti-vax movement than the anti-vax movement itself.
yeah, I didn't even know there was such a thing as anti-vax. I never even heard of such a thing.
They may have helped foster
Imagine
it.
there's some people who on principle don't get vaccines for religious reasons or whatever, but it never struck me that there was some sort of movement. But now there definitely is. And of course, I'm always accused of being part of it. So
Yeah,
Well,
well,
I'm accused these days, I'm
a,
accused of everything. So
I heard virologist, I guess is it's called, someone who studies viruses. He was saying that if you got the vaccine, the pandemic was over for you. And that when I heard that, I just knew that he was completely ridiculous. And you can't trust a scientist like that. It's just, it doesn't make any sense.
well,
So
and here's what's interesting too about this: that the EUAs on the vaccines, so the filings for the emergency use authorizations never ever promised to stop infection or spread. They promised 2 weeks of protection against severe outcomes. That's all they promised. That was in their filings, from late 2020.
it's all propaganda, man.
Yeah,
That's what it is.
unbelievable. All it took was anybody clicking on their filings, reading it, go, okay, what are they promising?
Well,
What they
it
promised.
changes. You discussed how they've tasted power and they don't want to let it go. I mean, what are some incremental things that we can do or even advocate? I mean, is it feasible to change the CDC or other quasi agencies into maybe competing groups, use antitrust on them or something?
I never really trust antitrust because people always imagine that antitrust is going to be some great pressure of power.
Right.
And it
Even
turns
just
out
calls
that,
to
of
break
course,
them up.
yeah, well, the problem is it's the same institution, government itself. You can't really break up the government by using the government. So that's a little bit tricky. I don't know what the mechanism is. I think what we've seen happen basically over 100 years in constitutional democracies like the US is the arrival of this new thing called an administrative state, which operates according to its own laws. And it's not, Congress has outsourced itself, to these agencies. They pay no attention to politics or elections. You can't fire them by law. And so it's metastasized and gotten bigger and bigger and bigger. And you can go through the agencies, whether it's the FTC, the SEC, the CDC, the NIH, Department of Homeland Security, you name it. I mean, that's the real state, and everything else sometimes looks as if it's just a kind of a decoration, on the cake. And so we pretend to elect leaders, but the leaders show up and they're like, wow, this is a big apparatus. It's an immense machinery that nobody seems to be able to control. And the reason is the administrative state's a lot smarter than the political state, because the political state consists of people who, in the case of the House of Representatives, they get elected, they serve for 2 years, and then they're kicked out, or they have to run for re-election again. So that's all they're focused on, getting reelected. That's all they get good at. And then in the case of the presidents and the Senate, it's 4 years, and they're out. So they're mainly concerned about polls and keeping their party in power and that sort of thing. So they're hugely distracted by the democratic project itself, and they can't be bothered to make any fundamental changes to the administrative state, which is what we really, really need. So the only thing I can really imagine fixing this, and I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon, is a complete restructuring of the way we think about the relationship between the individual and the government itself. And that's got to have something to do with completely reforming the administrative state. Before 1830 in this country, every newly elected official, from president to the Senate to the House, brought his entire own political machinery with him, fired everybody else because they assumed their loyalties lay elsewhere, and would put in place all new people to implement their vision. Same thing as a CEO going into a company. He's free to hire and fire whoever he wants, and you have to do that if you're going to turn around a company. So but by 18, I hope I'm getting the dates right. I think it was by about 1835 or something like this. This system came to be described attacked as the so-called spoils system, so
Right.
that anybody who got elected, he would bring all his own friends and fire everybody else, and so there was no deep state in those days for this reason. And people said, well, that's corrupt. All you're doing is rewarding your cronies with government jobs to live off the taxpayer. Okay, that sounds corrupt, but it's even more corrupt to have completely
It's pretending everyone's objective.
yeah, unchecked power by these deep state bureaucrats who serve as a kind of meta layer on top of what we think of as being the government. And that has gotten terrible, and it's gotten terrible through wars and depressions. I mean, it really, World War I, after World War I, the whole deep state just kind of took off, and then it got worse during the New Deal, it got worse during the Cold War, and it really gotten completely out of control in the last 20 or 30 years, to the point that it's, like, I'll just give you an example. When a Florida judge came down with a decision that said the CDC has no authority to force everybody to wear a mask on the plane, this authority does not exist in law. There was wailing and gnashing of teeth in Washington. People went absolutely crazy, from Psaki to Fauci to Collins to the entire apparatus of machinery of public health in this country just went nuts. What they said was not that you need to have a mask to protect yourself and others from disease. What they said, this decision is a threat to the CDC's authority. That's what they said. All right. So if you believe that, I mean, not just the decision, but
The threat.
the oversight itself. I mean, the fact that a judge could rule that something the CDC is doing is against the law, it's unconstitutional, itself is a grave danger to the CDC's authority. Now, if you believe that, what you're really saying is that this deep state unelected bureaucracy that spends, I don't know how much, 20 billion a year, whatever it is, with gazillion billion employees, should have unchecked dictatorial power and not be subject to any legislation or juridical oversight at all. If you believe that, you are really advocating a system that's more properly described as dictatorship. And
well, the argument they were making was basically an appeal to their power, right?
That's it.
Seems just like a complete logical fallacy. It's just,
well, they don't believe in freedom. I mean, they don't believe in constitutional republics. They don't believe in limits on government, which is to say, they don't believe in the great achievement of the Enlightenment project.
They believe that their science is so strong that they shouldn't be subject even to things like the rule of law.
They don't even believe in the rule of law. They believe in the rule of their own arbitrary authority. And they were so aggressive in saying this publicly, I almost couldn't believe it. I thought, are we really coming to the point in this country's history where you can have these bureaucrats get on TV and say, I think that I and my bureaucracy should have completely unchecked power to tell everybody what to do, and nobody should be in a position to limit me or question me. And that's what they said. Now, if that's true for the CDC, it's also true for the Department of Health. I mean, for the Department of Labor, Department of Agriculture, for the Federal Trade Commission, for everybody. If you really want a system where you've got, whatever it is, 185 different government bureaucracies with employees who can never be fired by new politicians, to be able to pass any kind of edicts they want whenever they want, and no court and no legislature, nobody can have anything to say about it, you really are talking about the arrival of a dystopian sort of technocracy that complies more with a kind of an ancient style dictatorship than you are with any kind of government, forms of government that we've aspired to have since probably the 13th century, since the Magna Carta.
Yeah, talking about reaching back to history, I found this great quote of yours online. You said, Lenin failed just as Gates, Powell, Fauci, and others have failed. Few things are more dangerous to the future of humanity than a failed and humiliated ruling class that still possesses power. They cannot and will not admit error, so their only plan is to double and triple down on failure. Does that mean expect more monkeypox in the news?
Yeah. By the way, I'm facing tremendous attacks for having noticed that that Gates had funded monkeypox disease preparation plans last year with the prediction that it would, with the expectation that it would be deployed in February 15th, 2022. So.
Well, you have taken a bunch of hits, and I just have to reiterate that it means so much to me that you're out there, that even the people you've assembled at Brownstone, I know, you all have taken hits for being brave, and it just, it inspires so many of us. It's not just me. I mean, a lot of my friends, I talked about you being about some libertarian organization being brave, and they were like, yeah, that's mostly Jeffrey Tucker. So people do appreciate the work that you're doing, and just keep being you.
Well, thank you. Like I said, I'm facing a tremendous amount of pressure. It's funny how these things happen. I don't know what's going to happen with monkeypox, and maybe it's not going to amount to anything. But the problem is that I've been, having written about the coronavirus in January 2020, we're seeing the exact same things, unfold now with the monkeypox that we saw with coronavirus back then. So I just we need to learn our lessons from this thing. And also, I don't think it should be wrong to say, and it doesn't make me QAnon, by the way, to observe that there are powers in the world that are up to no good, that don't want to see liberty thrive, and they're going to use any kind of excuse to get rid of it. And that's been true for as long as there's been states. And I don't think that in saying that, I'm saying anything particularly outrageous. I mean, if you're going to believe otherwise, you have to believe that that everybody's an angel. Everybody in public service all over the world is an angel. The World Economic Forum is just filled with earnest, beautiful people. The World Health Organization has no interests of its own, that it doesn't mind the interests of its donors, or that the donor base itself of the World Health Organization has no economic interests. I mean, they clearly do. And I don't think there's anything wrong with tracing this out and drawing attention to it and raising suspicions about what they're trying to do. It's not just intellectual error, although I think that's a lot of it. There's also financial interests involved, and it's just naive to pretend otherwise.
Yeah,
now, if it turns out I'm wrong, then that's great. I mean, if somebody can prove to me that the tabletop exercises for the monkey pox virus that were conducted last year were just earnest attempts at public health to try to contain disease, and it just so happens that on the very date at which the monkeypox is in the tabletop exercise was scheduled to become the beginnings of a pandemic, that the World Health Organization announced on its own website, changing it, that it is now a worldwide public health problem. Okay, maybe all of this is just purely coincidental, and everybody's an angel, and everybody's fine. The only problem is I think that the last 2 years should have taught us to be a little more circumspect, than we might have been in the past.
They sound like prophets of doom, and so they need to have this self-fulfilling prophecy, and then they have the remedy for it. It sounds very much, like a religious prophecy or something like that.
Yeah. So I don't know. I mean, I think my friends, we're dissidents against this rise of statism and mass hysteria and the attacks on freedom, which are growing by the day, really. I don't care that COVID seems to be over. You know, what is left in its wake is an immense apparatus, and it's very terrifying. And I'm not sure how to control it. I do know that we've got a long battle ahead of us, and we're all going to face enormous attacks, personal and otherwise, so long as we don't comply. And that's always been true. I mean, this is one of the main things you get out of the Rand novels, is that the people who act bravely and out of principle with courage don't always fare well in the public mind, and a lot of them suffer very much for their decisions. And she valorized people who exercised moral courage, and she warned that the threats were always around us. And sometimes people read her as being fiction, but I think the important thing about Rand to understand is that she used fiction to illustrate, to give readers a clearer picture of the realities all around us. That was the purpose of her writing. It wasn't just to tell a good story, though she did tell a good story. The point is, the story was filled with archetypes that fill our own worlds. You know, they're all around us. And the importance of reading her and understanding her message is to be better at recognizing the threats to our lives and our liberties that are much closer than you think, and to be prepared to battle with them. And she warned people, if you expect to keep freedom, you've got to fight for it. And that's where we find ourselves.
You're an archetype of bravery for me. I'm glad that just knowing that you're out there makes it easier for us to be brave with these monkeypox fights, or whatever they're going to be calling us for questioning them on their science. And it means a lot. I want to thank you so much for joining us, and just for what you're doing. William, any final thoughts?
Yeah, actually, I was hoping to ask you about religion, because one of the things that objectivists have been debating is how much to work with, like, religious conservatives or the right, forming coalitions against the left, because in my view, the left and the Marxists, they're a much bigger threat than anything coming from the right. But in doing some research, I found that you converted to Catholicism. Is that true? Are you still Catholic?
Oh yeah, well, I definitely converted to Catholicism, and think of that as being my my mental apparatus. I suppose the kind of Catholicism I converted to is of my own choosing. You know, it's a scholastic version of Saint Thomas variety. I would just say this about people that are gravely skeptical of religious historiography and categories. And I would say this to the people who are very much attached to religious traditions and think that they're the only way, that we all have a common interest in being free, and which means that we can develop a language, an understanding, and a common way to communicate too, without judging each other's philosophical priors. It's possible to cooperate with people who earnestly just want to be left alone and be free to engage with others and develop real communities of understanding. And I don't think that should exclude anybody, and if people want to stay up late debating the authorship of the New Testament, that's fine.
Well, I study the New Testament every week with a Christian friend of mine, and so I'm learning a lot about what Jesus taught, and I think there are some misinterpretations that a lot of objectivists have about the Bible, and so I'm looking for ways to unite with Christians and come to some agreement on basic principles.
Well, there's also plenty of Christians who have long had misunderstandings about the Bible too. So,
yeah.
So the misunderstandings go in all directions. I just, I think it's very important, and when civilization's really sweeping towards destruction, that we find people of whatever philosophical outlook who believe in human dignity and human rights and freedoms, and find a way to cooperate with them. And the stakes are too high, really, to get overly, I'd say, like, factional at this point, and that's
Yeah.
one of the things I've learned over the last 2 years, is that I didn't realize just how rotten the foundation of liberal society really was. That we had really lost that sort of cultural wide understanding of the importance of human rights. I mean, to the point the ACLU is itself, just completely gone full statist. I mean, it's a disaster. And so I think whether libertarians or Randians, objectivists or Christians or whatever, MAGA hats, I don't care. If people can figure out what matters most and work on that, then we've got a real cultural power here. And what often disables us is too much scrupulosity on the details. If my standard is lockdowns, really. I mean, like, if you're against the lockdowns, then I'm ready. I'm listening.
All right.
That's great.
Yeah. Oh, we're definitely against the lockdowns.
Okay.
Well, that's great. Just again, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to be here. And we could honestly do another whole show about creating unity in the liberty movement. So, but I'm definitely on your page there. So, but again, thank you for being here. Thank you, William. This has been the Ayn Rand Fan Club, and we will see you next time.